Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a first look at a brand new tank with a brand new gimmick. It's a tier 8 British heavy tank called the FV226 Contradictious, and it's got a double barrel. But not quite the traditional double barrel that we know from tanks like the TS-54. It is a brand new Selective Fire Mode double-barreled tank. Well, what does that mean? Well, I have a description here, and it's a wall of text. However, I have highlighted the important stuff. So, the new main mechanic is going to be called Selective Fire Mode. It basically means the tank is going to have two modes, which you switch into by pressing a button. It takes 2 seconds to switch into, and one mode is single fire, so where the gun will fire cyclically, exactly like any other normal cyclical fire tank. For example, the gun will work identical to the Renegade, for example. But then, if you switch modes by pressing X, you wait the 2 seconds, you switch into a new mode called Salvo Fire. And Salvo Fire will be familiar to you if you play a double barrel tank and you double barrel. However, the difference with the Salvo Fire mode for the FV226 is that the gun, there's no preparation time. You click fire and it will fire the double barrel. You know, with like the TS-54, you kind of have to hold it down or hold down your button, which you've bound to do the double barrel. You have to wait 2 or something seconds, and then it just fires the 2 shots. With the FV226, you press the button, it fires the 2 shots. So that's the difference. And then there is also a difference in terms of how the shells behave within your reticle. So in cyclical mode, your reticle will be traditional circle reticle. The shots will, traditionally fly to the center, and then you'll have RNG included within that. However, for the FV226, your reticle, once you switch into the mode, the Salvo Fire mode, will transform into an oval-like zone inside which the rounds will hit. And instead of the shells flying to the center of the reticle, obviously RNG involved, the shots are going to fire in a straight line out of the gun, either side of the center of the reticle, if that makes sense. So effectively, you'll have your reticle, and the 2 shells will fire, one to the left of it, one to the right of it, obviously with RNG included, which is new. And does open up some possibilities for some absolutely hilarious situations where you double barrel a tank's cupola, and the shots go either side of the tank's cupola instead of into the tank's cupola. But I digress. That is going to be the gun mechanic, so essentially how the gimmick, the new mechanic, the Selective Fire mode is going to work. However, in order to utilize Salvo Fire mode, you will pay the price in some of the tank's characteristics and statistics. Namely, you will be slower, your turret traverse speed will be worse, your guns will take longer to aim, and your dispersion will be significantly worse than in single fire mode. So this is in Salvo Fire mode. However, the stabilization of the guns will improve drastically, and obviously your alpha damage for a salvo, instead of it being, the same as one shot, which would be 360, it becomes 720 because you're firing the 2 shells, if that makes sense. But interestingly, the DPM will stay the same when you're in single fire mode or in Salvo Fire mode, because of how the gun reloading mechanic will work. Effectively, to fire the 2 shots in Salvo Fire mode, it will take twice the time to fire 1 shot in single fire mode, so you're still firing the same amount of shots in the same amount of time, hence the same DPM. So that's a very quick introduction to the new mechanic, which I think is important, and instead of just giving you a wall of text, I've tried to break it down as much as I can for you. But fortunately, the tank has been added to tanks.gg, which is really useful because it means we can look at the armor model and actually have a look at the statistics and how the siege mode, the Salvo Fire mode, is actually going to affect statistics. So its base DPM is going to be 2048 outside in single fire mode, which is not bad. We're going to have a decent rate of fire, 5.69 rounds a second, which is all right. Aim time, 1.73 seconds is actually really quite nice. Dispersion, 0.32. Once again, really quite nice. So this tank's gun handling and gun behaviors in single fire mode are going to be really quite comfy. Good DPM, you know, good aim time, good dispersion. However, the tank is not particularly the quickest to start off with. And obviously, when you do switch into that salvo mode, you are slower. So 36 is not going to be the quickest. You know, for example, if you were to put a standard turbo in the slot, 41, still not particularly quick. So, you know, do consider that, and that this tank is not going to be particularly the quickest to start off with. You do have 10 degrees of gun depression, which is a pretty standard characteristic on most British heavy tanks. To be fair, on most British tanks, they have 10 degrees of gun depression nowadays. Your armour on paper is really quite nice. 150 for the hull frontally is really quite nice for tier 8, actually. And 250 for the turret is going to be really quite nice, and we'll have a look at this effective armour in a second using the 3D model. Your HP base is 1500, which is, once again, quite nice. And for example, if you were to use your field mods and then put a hardening in the slot, 1700, which is quite nice. It's all right. 1500 base is a little bit low, but to be fair, most tanks at tier 8 nowadays, especially heavies, have 1500. And your view range, 370 meters, is quite low. It's not as good as tanks like the Renegade, for example, which has 400. So, let's have a look at this tank visually first. So, as you can see, in my opinion, it has literally the best looking gun barrels and gun flares in the game. That is, like, I'm sorry, excuse my language, fucking awesome. Like, look at that. That is really, really cool. Almost like a tornado-esque symbol on the end of each gun. And yeah, it kind of looks like almost as if you crossed a Cobra with like a T-57 heavy almost, and then gave it some cool-ass end-of-gun barrel flares. But let's have a look at the live armor, which is the important thing. So frontally, if it's to be shooting it itself with its AP, 218mm of penetration, it is going to be struggling to pen itself. You know, lower plate, 70% chance, lower upper plate, 30%, and then turret, you're just not penning. It does have a cupola, which is semi-big on flat ground, but the important thing is going to be, what does the gold ammo do to it? Well, you know, it's still going to be pretty well armored, to say the least. You know, when you do fire that and dab that 2 key and fire the gold at this tank's hull, it will become weaker, and especially weaker against tier 8 tanks with better gold penetration than 255mm, which is quite low. So tier 8 mediums with gold penetrations of 280 plus will reliably pen your hull. And, you know, especially TDs, you know, don't expect him to be bouncing much on your hull. But, you know, and against standard rounds and against tier 7, tier 6 tanks and tier 8 heavies with standard rounds, yeah, you know, you will bounce fairly reliably. But once again, as I said, don't really rely on it. However, how's this tank going to look in its gun? Oh, okay, that's quite scary. So this is with gold ammo. Yeah, definitely gold ammo. Okay, so the cupola is not tiny. It exists. However, when we look at it visually, it's not particularly the easiest to see, and it's kind of a little bit disguised by this kind of like machine gun attachment. So, you know, it's quite big, but it doesn't look that big. So, interesting. And, you know, for example, if you're using this tank in a hull down, yeah, I mean, good luck penning it, I guess. You're going to need basically 300 plus millimeters of penetration to even get close to penning this tank. And even then, you're going to have to shoot it square down the middle of the gun. You know, tier 9 and tier 10 tanks with good heat penetrations will, you know, be penning this tank 50-50, you'd say. You know, especially if they can hit basically the square around and in between the guns. But, you know, if you're playing against tier 8 tanks, they kind of have to hit your cupola if you're hull down, or good luck. I mean, it's not the smallest, as I said, but it's relatively well disguised. So armor-wise, this tank is looking really quite good. But let's have a look at this tank's statistics as if it was using the siege mode. So, we've now pressed X, we've waited the 2 seconds, obviously you can still be reloading during this 2 seconds, and now we're in salvo mode. So what this does is it changes our alpha damage from 360 to 720 because we're firing 2 shots at once. However, you can see the impact it has to the gun handling as mentioned. Your aim time now becomes 3.36 seconds, which is terrible. Your dispersion is I believe 1.15 is now the worst dispersion in the game. That is ridiculous. 1.15 dispersion is so incredibly bad, which basically forces this tank to use its double barrel as humanely close as possible. You basically want to be in cyclical mode up until about 10 meters away from your opponents, because 1.15 dispersion, oh my god, is that bad. You basically need to have your gun in your opponent to be able to hit all your shots reliably. So that is quite the penalty, to say the least. Obviously, as I said, your DPM stays the same. It's the same amount of shots in the same amount of time, but your speed becomes terrible once again. So another reason to, you know, be using this as close to your opponents as possible, 20 seconds. So, you know, you basically want to be in cyclical mode up until the point where an opponent pushes you on, I don't know, 650 HP. You press X, you switch into your salvo mode, you drive up to them, you face hug them, you find the weakest part of their armor, and then you click. And then hopefully pen both your shots and do 720 to them instead of 360 to them. That's basically the use for this this salvo mode. Obviously, there are going to be other uses, but I feel that's going to be the most effective use. You know, trading off, 16 kilometers an hour of base speed and so much dispersion and aim time basically forces you to use it as close to your opponents as possible. And interestingly, the salvo mode also seems to have a very slight impact on your camo rating, but only on the move. So your camo rating outside of the salvo mode, so in cyclical mode, your stationary camo is 6.8%, and your moving camo is 0.35%. But when you're in the salvo mode, it's 3.44 stationary and 0.17 moving. So it basically halves it. I mean, it exactly halves it, actually, which is interesting, I guess. But yeah, it's quite the trade-off, to put it simply, to decide to use the salvo mode. And I feel like this is the way it should be. This tank would be really, really, I feel, almost borderline broken if this tank kept these statistics in its salvo mode, because, you'd be doing 720 damage pretty reliably at mid to long range, which is just shouldn't be a thing. You should be doing 360 at mid to long range, which is what this tank's cyclical gun handling allows it to do. And then when you switch into the salvo mode, it's basically for those up close and personal brawling fights where you need the alpha damage whilst maintaining the DPM. So you gain that single shot alpha, 720 instead of 360, without costing DPM. So that's basically what it's going to be used for. And obviously, once you trade off that speed, even more the reason to use it up close. So for example, let's see what using field mods does to the speed if you run a turbo. So if you run a turbo and then are in the salvo mode, you can get it up to 25, which is better. But still, 25 is slow and even more of an excuse to be barely spending much time, especially while you're trying to get into position in salvo mode. So, what are my opinions of this tank going to be? Well, I think it's looking really exciting, in my opinion. I like this new idea for a gimmick. It's a fun twist on the traditional double-barreled tanks, which we've had now for a while. And out of the gimmicks we've had added recently, I feel like it's one of the more exciting ones. It has a lot of potential. And with this tank being, in my opinion, the tier 8 premium for a future tech tree, potentially the next tech tree we will see in the game, being the future premium for that tech tree, I think it's really exciting. There's a lot of potential with this mechanic to have some really funky, decent tier 10, have a really decent tier 10 tank here. Which may be meta relevant because, being able to keep that DPM, but in certain situations, being able to increase your alpha, or basically double your alpha, is really important, especially in comp. Obviously, it does depend what the trade-offs you have to make are, which is pretty significant, as we can see here on the tier 8. But I feel like it has a lot of potential. And an interesting thing to note is because this tank has basically gone onto the Supertest, and then gone into the common test files right away, that is a good sign that we will likely be seeing this tank very soon. And when I say very soon, I feel Christmas time. I feel like this tank is going to be included in the holiday opt boxes for 2024, especially as it's likely we're going to see the WZ Grom, which I have done a video on recently, as through some kind of mission marathon. I feel like this tank will be perfect to go into the holiday ops loot boxes to get the premium before they release the a potential tech tree in end of January, February, March time of 2025. But do let me know down in the comments, do you agree with me? Do you think this is a tier 8 premium for a future tech tree of British double-barreled heavy tanks? Or do you disagree with me? Do let me know down in the comments, and do let me know what you think about this tank, because I have some opinions, I want to know yours. And if you did like this video, don't forget to check out the 2 videos on screen now, the video and the playlist, and click subscribe, and I'll see you all very soon.